evening, everybody, and welcome to the West Virginia Archives and History Library's Thursday evening lecture. Before we get started, I do have a few remarks on some of the upcoming lectures. On May 5th at 6 o'clock, Outlaws in West Virginia, War, Whiskey, and Wonder, and Not a Robin Hood in Sight by Dr. Melissa Sartori. And coming up on May 14th at 6 o'clock, Salt in the Kanawha Valley, One Family's View by Carter and Nancy Bruns. That's J.Q. Dickinson Salt Works. Then on May 21st at 6 o'clock, the block speaker series will pick back up with Louis Smoot. He'll be speaking that night. Tonight, Dr. Billy Joe Peyton will present Making the Crooked Way Straight and the Rough Way Smooth, Engineering and Construction of the National Road. Planning for the Cumberland Road, or National Road, began in 1806 with construction carried out by the federal government from Cumberland, Maryland to Wheeling, Virginia, West Virginia. Between 1811 and 1821, featuring a modern paved surface and state-of-the-art bridges and culverts, it was the nation's first interstate highway and an immensely popular route that transformed Wheeling into a gateway to the West. Dr. Peyton will discuss engineering and construction of the National Road and the prominent role it played in the nation's early growth and history and development. Dr. Peyton received his BA, MA, and PhD in history from West Virginia University. His 30-year public history career began in the 1980s at Cricket's Fort State Park, West Virginia Public Broadcasting, the National Park Service, and Kmore coal mine site. Dr. Peyton later worked as Associate Director of the Institute for the History of Technology and Industrial Archaeology at WVU, Cultural Resource Specialist at an historical architecture firm, and high school history teacher. He is currently Professor of History at the College of Business and Social Sciences at West Virginia State University and co-director of the Glenwood Center for Scholarship in the Humanities. Dr. Peyton's publication credits include entries in the West Virginia Encyclopedia, print and online versions, a chapter in the National Road, The Road and American Culture, 1996, and two local history works titled Charleston, Then and Now, in 2009, and Charleston, The First 225 Years, in 2013. He has also worked as writer and historian on several documentary films, including Ghost of Green Bottom, Red Salt and Reynolds, and the Midland Trail, and may be seen in the 56 States series on the History Channel. Dr. Peyton lives with his wife Christine, their two children, and a pair of unruly hounds in a 100-year-old home in Charleston's East End Historic District. Please welcome Dr. Peyton.
Thank you, Randy, even though I wrote that. I like to hear it every time. Let me make sure this works. It'd probably help if I turned it the right way. There we go. Okay. Thanks, everyone, for showing up tonight. And again, thanks to Archives and History for this wonderful series and allowing me to be part of it, which I've done several talks. This one is probably the one that's nearest and dearest to my heart, because this was the subject of my dissertation at WVU. And when I was in grade school, I got really intrigued with roads. I probably should have been a civil engineer, but I couldn't do engineering. But I was very interested in the Appian Way, and I built a little clay model of the road. And then later on, I built a Macadam model out of clay, which I still have, which is partially melted now, but I still have it. So I've had this long interest in roads and their impact on society. And when I was working on my PhD under Dr. Emery Kemp at WVU back in the 90s, Dr. Kemp suggested that I take a look at the National Road. I knew a little bit about it, but like most folks, I got my history of it from a history book when I was in school. Kind of the same way I teach it to my students. Our first federally funded highway was the National Road, otherwise known as the Cumberland Road. Dr. Kemp suggested I go to the archive, National Archives, because there are records there that had never been researched and never been tapped. And I went to the archives in Washington, spent a week in 1995, I think it was, and I found a treasure trove of archival material that literally had never had the seal broken on it. It had been packed away when the federal government gave the road back to the states in the 1830s, and I don't think anyone broke the wax. And I actually had the privilege of going up into the stacks with the archivist who was in charge of Record Group 77, which was the Army Corps of Engineers record group. And he was tickled to death that someone wanted to look at the National Road records. He'd been the steward of these things for his whole career, and no one had ever come asking about them. And I came and he said, I've got to show you what we have. And he took me upstairs, and it's unbelievable what they have. So I was able to actually look at a lot of the primary source documents dealing with the planning and the construction of the road. As Dr. Kemp told me, and I found out on my own to be true, a lot of folks have covered the political history of the road, but virtually no one had looked at its planning and construction. So that's the genesis of this project, and I'm hoping someday soon that I will submit a manuscript to WVU Press and that they will accept it, and that this may come out in book form in the next, I would hope, 3 years or so, but that remains to be seen. Let's start before 1800, and this is a map that gives you a good indication of what overland transportation was like in the new United States of America before 1800. And if you train your eyes on West Virginia, or where we would later be in Western Virginia, you'll see that there's a real shortage of east-west routes, mainly because of our terrain. But there is a corridor that goes to and through our northern panhandle. There, one of those routes would eventually become the general route of the National Road. At that time, it would have been Braddock's Road, which I'll talk about in a little bit. After 1800, because we're a growing country and our boundaries are moving westward, there would be a need to build highways. So by 1830, those were just the principal overland routes, turnpikes mainly, but also private roads that were built. And the National Road is in there somewhere. You'll also see that West Virginia now has many east-west routes, turnpikes primarily, but not very many north-south routes, again, because of our terrain. And we really wouldn't have a major north-south route until we get the modern U.S. highway system, and then today the interstate system, I-79. Which whisks us up to Mountaineer games on Saturday. Just to give you a timeline of the planning and ultimately the construction of the first segment of the National Road. It all starts with the U.S. Constitution in 1789, and there is a clause in the Constitution known as the Postal Clause, and it's in Article 1 of the Constitution, which simply says that Congress has the ability to establish post offices and post roads. Now, in those days, as we're trying to link our country, it's very important to have reliable postal service, because just about every form of communication traveled by post. And that is the authorization by which Congress would try to hang building and funding the National Road. And there would be some problems with raising enough funding. There's also a constitutional issue of how far can we stretch the literal interpretation of the Constitution to build basically a civilian road. It's not necessarily a post road, although there were post offices along it. With the election of Thomas Jefferson in 1801, we began formulating the idea to build some national roads. Now, originally the intent was not to have one single solitary route, but to have a number of federally funded highways throughout the country. But funding is going to be an issue. Jefferson would appoint as his Secretary of the Treasury an influential gentleman by the name of Albert Gallatin, who you see here, the small gentleman you see in the portrait there. Gallatin would be the father of the National Road. There are three folks that I credit with doing the road and completing it, and he by far is the most important. I'll talk about him a little bit later. Again, one of the problems is where do we find funding, and does the federal government have the ability to fund a private road? Gallatin decides that he can find that means. In the Statehood Act that would allow Ohio to become a state in 1803, there is a clause attached to it called the 2% fund. And the idea was that 2% of the sale of public lands in the future state of Ohio would go to building roads to and through the state of Ohio. So that's, again, that's sort of the reasoning that would allow us to start thinking about funding roads. And later on, that type of a clause would be extended to other states that would join the Union to develop their infrastructure, which at the time was known as internal improvements. Today we call it infrastructure. In 1806, things moved very quickly. The president would sign the Cumberland Road bill, which is a bill that works through Congress to actually set up funding apparatus for the road, not necessarily through the 2% fund, as it turns out. And then shortly thereafter, commissioners would be chosen to select the route for the road. In 1806 through 1808, they do their work, and then construction begins in 1811. It's completed in 1821, although most popular sources say the work was done in 1818. It was not yet complete. All contracts were done in 1821. Here's my favorite founding father, and someone who doesn't get much credit these days with his contributions to our country, mainly because he was not from the USA. He was from Switzerland, had a very thick Swiss-French accent, which caused him some trouble when he was working in the federal government. He came to the United States at the tender age of 19 and built a house on the very fringe of civilization in western Pennsylvania, not far from Morgantown, just outside of Point Marion. And he called that home Friendship Hill. It still stands, and today it's a National Historic Site, operated by the Park Service, National Park Service. And it's quite a site. If you ever get a chance to see it, you should visit. Turns out when he's appointed by Jefferson, he stayed for 13 years as Treasury Secretary, the longest serving Treasury Secretary in the history of the United States. He follows, of course, Alexander Hamilton and Hamilton's very large shadow, and he would help craft some of our basically financial basis for this country. He later would serve in the House of Representatives, was our minister or ambassador to both France and Great Britain, and he was a Renaissance man. He was one of the founders of New York University, Historical Society of New York, and the American Ethnological Society. So he was a linguist and ethnographer and did a lot of different things. He also would author in 1808 a blueprint for how we should develop our internal improvements, and it was just simply called the Road, or the Report on Roads and Canals. And he laid out specific routes, including the Potomac-Monongahela route, which is roughly where the National Road would go, the James and Canal route, which would be a canal and a turnpike, and numerous other very important routes. Also, another interesting tidbit, that is actually a photograph of Gallatin. He'd be one of the only folks of his generation to actually live long enough to have a daguerreotype done of him. That was done in the 1840s. He died at the age of 80, I think about 88 he died. Okay, remember the 2% fund. Well-intentioned, however, 1805 there wasn't very much money in it, only $12,000, which based on what the National Road would cost, that would have built about 1 mile of the route. So the 2% fund is not going to provide enough money to build one road, let alone a series of federally funded highways. So the U.S. Senate, through one of their committees on internal improvements, decides that maybe we should concentrate and focus on simply one important corridor and one route. And the language reads that this road, which would become the national road, would begin in Cumberland, Maryland, and make its way to the Ohio River, somewhere opposite Steubenville, Ohio, at the mouth of Grave Creek, which puts it at about Moundsville area, if you're from that neck of the woods. And it would stop at the Ohio River, a little below Wheeling. So that gives us a basic idea of where the road's going to go. Now, the first question you must ask yourself is, why Cumberland, Maryland? Right? And this is why. All about location. Cumberland is nestled right at the eastern base of the Appalachians, essentially. If you see where I've circled up there, there's a natural water gap just west of Cumberland known as the Narrows of Wills Creek. And Wills Creek comes down from the north and joins the Potomac at Cumberland. The Potomac flows on, of course, to the Chesapeake Bay and to the Atlantic coastline. So Cumberland, from really the French and Indian War on, was an outpost for western migration, as well as factored significantly in the early campaigns of the French and Indian War for necessity. Braddock's march to the forks of the Ohio later on. So Cumberland is sort of a natural jumping off point, and its strategic location is why. That's actually a Google view of the Narrows, and that's a natural water gap, so it forms an easy way to get through. Now, also, one thing that would factor into Cumberland is private interests in Baltimore had been talking for some time about linking Baltimore with the western waters, and there was construction had already started on a privately funded road out of Baltimore that was to go to Cumberland, and it was known as the Bank Road because it was funded by interests in and around Baltimore, including banks there. And also Braddock's Road, that French and Indian War route, ill-fated route blazed by General Edward Braddock on his way west, where he met his demise, would follow the general route. Now, the Cumberland Road bill, in those days, congressional bills were short and sweet, right to the point. Nowadays, they're 1,000 pages long or so. You need to scrutinize them for days to figure out what they say. But in those days, they were pretty simple. This is about a one-page bill, give or take a few paragraphs. It set up the parameters for building this Cumberland Road or National Road. Those are the two interchangeable names that were used. It was also just known as the road later on. Everyone assumed they knew what they were talking about. This regulates the laying out and making of the road from Cumberland to the state of Ohio. Where it will end, no one knows yet. And it gave the president direct authority to appoint 3 discreet and disinterested citizens who would be commissioners to lay out the route of the roads. 3 individuals with no political axe to grind, theoretically. The president has the right to accept or reject their recommendation for a route, so there's some politics that would come to play there. And the president himself would oversee construction, administration, and finances. Now, imagine that today. You go all the way to the White House to have a road built. We were a very small country in those days. And remember, this is the first time that our government had tried this. Those 3 commissioners were, in fact, discreet and disinterested politically, for the most part. Joseph Carr, as he pronounced his name, is from Ohio. He had considerable experience as a surveyor. He was a justice of the peace. He had worked in the public sector, would become a politician later. In fact, in the midst of the survey, he actually left the team and had to go to Ohio when he was elected to the House of Representatives there. He and Ely Williams, which is how you pronounce apparently E-L-I-E, not Eli, but Ely, I was told by folks from Williamsport, which is a town founded by his family in Maryland. He was a Revolutionary War veteran. He had been an Army contractor during the Indian Wars on the frontier, so he had spent a lot of time in the Western country. He also had done some surveying, had surveyed, or would later survey the C&O Canal route. Many of these individuals went on to work on other internal improvements projects, including Williams. And then finally, Thomas Moore from Maryland was a farmer and an inventor. He was also a Renaissance man. He invented this ice box that he called the refrigerator, which apparently was one of the first use of that term to describe an ice box. He later would become principal engineer in Virginia, building Virginia's turnpikes, and he was elected to the American Philosophical Society, which was a prestigious honor. So he was of the intellectual elite at that time, mainly due to his inventions and his wit and ingenuity. We have no image of Carr and only a silhouette of Moore that I've ever found. When the commissioners began the survey and set up the team to actually survey the route, they had 4 basic objectives laid out. Find the shortest distance between the 2 points. That would be the Potomac and Cumberland in the Ohio, somewhere around Grave Creek or Wheeling, linking the eastern and western waters. Cross the Monongahela at a point that maximized the ability to actually jump in the river and boat down it. That would turn out to be Brownsville, Pennsylvania. And on the Ohio River, again, at a point capable of combining river and road. And at that time, Wheeling was the farthest north you could get on the Ohio year-round, before locks and dams were put on the river to level out river levels, and other flood control was created. Wheeling was about as far as you could go. So that means Wheeling is going to be the northernmost point you could essentially build this road. And logically, the shortest route with the most benefits. The shortest route would tend to be the cheapest route also. But you can't do a short route in the mountains often. You have to go around, not through them. These are, I just stuck these in there because in addition to finding letters and bits and pieces of contracts and correspondence and some lawsuits, I also found the commissioner's 1806 journal, their surveyor's journal that was kept by Ely Williams. Don, I think you'll be interested in that. Don Teeter there in the front row as a surveyor. And Williams kept the journal. Apparently each of the commissioners kept their own journal, and they combined all their notes into one, which Williams scribed. And that's it, and that's at the National Archives. That's the first page and the last page of that 1806 journal. It's probably 70 to 80 pages. I copied each and every one of them. When the commissioners submitted their final report to President Jefferson, they called for the route to be built in the style of a stone-covered turnpike, and that was it in terms of any specific specifications for material or construction method. Pretty vague, again. They did call for 66-foot right-of-way with improved, completely finished conduits to allow all-season travel, which is very important. One of the problems with early roads is that they got too wet, too mushy. They got rutted very easily, and they wanted to try to avoid that so this road could be a reliable, modern transportation nexus. It would essentially be 131 miles long when it's finally constructed to Wheeling. They would estimate a cost of $6,000 per mile, which would turn out to be about half what it really costs. So some things have not changed, right? Cost overruns are still part of the picture often. One of the common misconceptions is that it followed Braddock's Road exactly. It sort of deviated a little bit due to the terrain. And the original route bypassed both Washington, Pennsylvania, and Uniontown, PA, but that would not stand because at that point the president intervened and Gallatin intervened, and they actually changed the route to include both of those towns. And the reason that I found is this sums it up. This is a letter Gallatin sent to Jefferson after the report came back. Basically, we got to include Washington and then include Uniontown because we need those votes. And if we don't include them, we're going to lose Pennsylvania in the next election. So that says a lot. And here is the route as finally laid out. You'll see there's a dog leg. So the route as constructed was not exactly the shortest, most direct, but it does include the most population. I'm sorry?
Gallatin took it to his town friendly.
No, it did not go to Friendship Hill, no, which is interesting. Yeah, the question up front is Gallatin took the road right through Friendship Hill where he lived, and he did not, which is, it's close, but it didn't go right through it. And here are my big three. I've already mentioned Albert Gallatin for obvious reasons. His contribution was coming up with a financial package that theoretically could fund it, although ends up not being successful. He had the vision for internal improvements and what they could do to boost the country economically and tie us together as one people also. Very important. And his leadership. He's the father of the road. The next supporter and proponent on the political end is none other than Henry Clay. And we have someone here from Claysville, Pennsylvania, named for Mr. Clay. He was in both the U.S. House and the Senate, long-standing member of Congress, big supporter of internal improvements and what was then called the American Plan, supporting tariffs to boost manufacturing, federal financing of internal improvements, and infrastructure, and also a strong national bank. Number three is someone that most of you, maybe all of you, have never heard of. He's the guy on the ground. His name is David Shriver Jr. Don't have any photos or portraits of him that I've ever found. He was superintendent of construction for the project from the first shovel of dirt that was turned until it was completed to wheeling. And then he stayed on the project for 3 more years and supervised some of the work west of the Ohio River. So while some of the superintendents and some of the parties involved with the road came and went, he stayed with it from beginning to end. And he was the man that did everything. I found his name in the vast majority of correspondence either came from Shriver, was intended to go to Shriver, or mentioned him as far as day-to-day carrying out of activity on the road. He did everything. Bids and contracts were issued by him. He handled payroll. He was essentially the paymaster. And any labor disputes which came up went to Shriver's desk, and he would try to handle them. He is the unsung hero in my mind. Came from a prominent Maryland family, bankers and public servants. But if you look at any published literature on the road, he gets a bare mention. Hopefully my book will change that if I actually finish it. Just to give you, I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail on construction as it worked its way west, other than construction began in the spring of 1811 and moved fairly quickly for the first year or so through 1813, but then got bogged down during the War of 1812. Progress slowed from the intervening years 1813 to 1815, and then picked back up. About 45 miles were complete by the end of 1815, moving from east to west. And ultimately, when construction got to Brownsville and a little bit beyond, the supervision of the project was divided into east and west. And Shriver handled the eastern section of construction, and another superintendent was hired in the west, who eventually would get fired. Talk about him in a minute. The date that everybody mentions, and all the historic markers say the road was complete in 1818 to Wheeling. Essentially, that's when mail service began from Baltimore to Wheeling, but all the contracts, as I mentioned, weren't finished for 3 more years. And that's actually a view of Wheeling. I couldn't find a clearer image, unfortunately, but that's a view of Wheeling. The National Road is in, the National Road is coming down Wheeling Hill right here. Comes into downtown and crosses the Wheeling Suspension Bridge, which would be built later in 1849 to carry the road onto Ohio. The National Road led to the establishment of what would become known as pike towns. And there is a classic history of the National Road that was written in 1889 by Joseph Seawright. called just simply the old pike. And he refers to dozens of pike towns, and I'll show you a map in a minute that have more on here, but towns like LaVale, Maryland, Claryville in Maryland, Claysville, Bealsville, West Alexander, Pennsylvania, Valley Grove, Elm Grove, Triadelphia in West Virginia were all pike towns that didn't exist really before the road came through, and their main streets front right on the route. And you can drive the old route, the road today, and you'll still go through the downtowns of many of those pike towns, and they resemble very closely what they looked like 150 or more years ago. The labor for the project was mainly English and Irish immigrants arriving on our soil trying to find work, and of course they would get the labor jobs, and there were a number of places I've read commentary about the labor itself. One observer commented about one contractor, his immortal Irish Brigade. Now, these are not Civil War soldiers, but the Irish Brigade being a large labor crew. Josiah Thompson, I just put him in there as an example of someone who had a profound impact on the towns that would emerge and worked on the road in several capacities. He started out as being the original surveyor on the surveying team, stayed with it through the original survey, and then he applied for the Western Superintendency, got it. In the meantime, he purchased farmland that would later become Triadelphia, West Virginia, and he was actually accused of impropriety because he allegedly rerouted the road to go right by his farm. But Shriver indicated that he had purchased the farmland before he was actually hired as superintendent. So that quelled that argument. But he got in a little trouble later because the cost of the project west in the western section, where the terrain is gentler, was more expensive than the eastern section under his supervision. But he actually founded Triadelphia. People think that Triadelphia is named for his three sons. He is buried behind the Catholic Church in Triadelphia today. And he was one of the founders of Triadelphia, West Virginia. Came here to work on the road. There you go. That's the original eastern section of the road, starting at Cumberland at Wills Creek. The route changes a little bit. Coming out of Cumberland, initially, this is kind of a head scratcher. Initially, the route was to go over Wills Mountain, and it was exceedingly difficult to actually cut the route over this very large mountain. So then the decision was made to take it through the water gap, through the Narrows. It was not initially done, but later changed. But you can see some of the important towns. And the road would cross a number of rivers and streams. So bridges and culverts would be needed, a lot of them. And you know, anytime roads are built in this terrain, you need a lot of cutting, filling, and bridges. That's the western section from Uniontown on, Brownsville on the Monongahela. Has also a very important bridge I'll talk about. And you move west to Little Washington, as most people know it, if you're from that area. Claysville and West Alexander, almost on the Virginia, now West Virginia border, and then ultimately drop over the hill and come down Wheeling Hill into Wheeling. This just gives you an idea of the terrain that had to be overcome in building this route. If you've ever traveled in western Maryland, about 9 months out of the year, it's probably snowing when you get to Frostburg. I'm exaggerating a bit, but weather seems to always hang in those higher elevations of Garrett County, western Maryland, and Allegheny County. It's because that's some of the highest terrain in that part of the country. You can see once you climb from Cumberland up to Big Savage and then Meadow Mountain, you're approaching near enough 3,000 feet. A couple places right at 3,000. The highest point is Negro Mountain, which still is named Negro Mountain, although there's been some movement to try to change its name, but it's been unsuccessful. And then you drop over Kaiser's Ridge down to Summerfield and the big Yakagani River, and then back up to Woodcock Hill, drop back down to Uniontown. If you've ever been to the top of the mountain outside of Uniontown, Chestnut Ridge, that's also the prevailing ridge that runs all the way down into West Virginia, and you can see it from the Nile ground in Morgantown, actually, on the eastern horizon. It's a very long ridge.
Did those businesses pay to have their names put on this map?
Yeah, I think they probably did. That was actually a postcard. Okay, another of the misconceptions about the road, and I've seen it as recently as doing research for this talk tonight. The myth is that the Corps of Engineers built the National Road. They did not. They were nowhere near the original construction of the National Road. They were not mandated at that point in time to actually work on civilian projects. They were strictly the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers at that point in time. The Treasury Department managed the project and handled it. They hired the workers. Albert Gallatin oversaw it with consultation with the President of the United States. And the original road was not built on the Macadam plan. It's not macadamized because the Macadam plan of road building did not yet exist in this country when the road was started and built. That comes later, but that myth is still out there. This is just one of the original advertisements issued 1819 under Shriver. The subscriber will attend at his office in Brownsville in the state of Pennsylvania for the purpose of receiving proposals in writing for constructing the whole or any part of the United States road between Uniontown and Washington in the state of Pennsylvania. That's essentially the bid document there, the request for proposals. So what was the surface of the road originally? In my research, I found a lot of descriptions of how bad the road was, but very few that told me what it actually was constructed to be or how it was built. Until I was looking at one of the drawings of one of the bridges, and in the margin of that drawing, someone had fortunately sketched out a cross-section of the road. And as close as I can judge it, and in consultation with Dr. Kemp in Morgantown, it looks like it's a variation on what was in the French method called the Trezeguet method, who was a big French road builder. And essentially it's a one foot deep channel filled with 7-inch stones that had been sized roughly at 7 inches, topped with a layer of stones that fit through a 3-inch ring. And that was it. You'll notice what's not there, no drainage ditches on the side. There is a camber to the road to allow drainage, but one of the big problems was that whenever it rained, the water just sat there. And if you have freeze and thaw, it would begin to break up the pavement really quickly. And the wagons that were traveling on the road were heavy. Some of them were 1.5 tons or more in weight, pulled by 6 horses or more, and that's going to destroy the surface, which it did very, very quickly. It didn't take long before there were problems. Now, probably the most outstanding feature of the entire project are the bridges that still survive 200 years after they were built. And they are magnificent. They were magnificent then when they were constructed out of stone, arch bridges, and they are spectacular today if you see them. Starting in the east, the first major bridge river crossing was at Cumberland Road, which today we know is the Little Yakagani River in western Maryland. There's a little crossings bridge, interestingly. It, at the time, was the largest single-span stone arch bridge and the largest stone arch that had been constructed in the United States of America. And it rivaled anything that was being built in Europe at the time in terms of its design and its size. The arch itself is 80 feet in span. The bridge is over 300 feet long over the Castleman. It is now a National Historic Landmark. The road bypassed this bridge when a new bridge was built in the late 1920s to carry what would later then be Route 40. But it's still there and you can walk on it. It's now a park. And it was hailed as a superb specimen of engineering. The next one, very interesting, over the great crossings of the Youghiogheny in Pennsylvania, would be at the former site of the town of Summerfield, because Summerfield, if you know that area, is now under Youghiogheny Lake. Summerfield is gone, all except the foundations that are left, and some of the old sidewalks are still there. When the river is at low water, you can actually see them. This is a magnificent triple arch span, which crossed the river almost 400 feet, 375 feet. It has 3 different sized arches that range from 60 feet, the largest 90 feet, which makes the one single arch the largest stone arch at the time that existed in the United States. If you combine all 3 of them, again, a magnificent specimen of engineering. And today, it's under Youghiogheny Lake most of the time. Twice in recent memory, in 1991 and 1998, when we had droughts, the level of the lake was so low that the bridge came out like a phoenix, and apparently souvenir hunters took bits and pieces of it both times. And you can see people are walking on it. I actually went with some colleagues from WVU, and we actually went there. Didn't take any parts that I know of, but we photographed it and just stood in awe. And that's the original route of the Youghiogheny. Summerfield is right there. This is a historic view taken roughly from the same angle. And Summerfield was in the bottom on the right-hand side for the most part. You can actually make out one sidewalk right there. So that's downtown Summerfield, which was flooded, I think, about 1943 or so to build Youghiogheny Lake. This is actually on the National Register, and the best preservation for it is when the river covers it back up. It becomes an attraction nuisance when it's like this, when people take parts out of the souvenirs off of it. In West Virginia, there would be a couple of landmark bridges. One, which unless you know it's there, you may not recognize it, at Elm Grove, was built in 1817 near the Moses and Lydia Shepherd estate, which is another story that Lydia wooed Henry Clay and convinced him to reroute the road right in front of their estate, their home, which still exists, called Monument Place in Wheeling today. And there was a big statue of Henry Clay in the front yard of Monument Place for many, many years, and it's not there anymore. But this is the bridge in question, and it's at Elm Grove. In the late 1950s, our highway department covered it in gunite. And there's been talk for a number of years of removing the gunite to restore it to its beauty, former beauty. And that's a piece of the gunite that fell off a few years ago, right there. The gunite was put on just to sort of hold everything together so it didn't break apart and fall into the river. But it's a gorgeous arch span. Still carries traffic. And it's among the oldest, if not the oldest, active bridge in the state of West Virginia today. There would be numerous other anomalies, and of course one engineering landmark unsurpassed anywhere at the time. Starting in the upper left, there is a mysterious S bridge. There are actually 2 of them in Pennsylvania. There's one that's left. A mysterious S bridge crossing a stream near Washington in Washington County. And that also is an original bridge. It still exists in part, although one end was shaved off when the road was straightened a little bit. A lot of folks ask, why an S bridge? Basically, an S bridge, as I understand it, in order to get the bridge over a creek that doesn't cross the road at a 90-degree angle, you essentially build the span, the arch span, at an angle, and in order to get it to line up with the road, it's like what I used to do when I did my model railroads, because they never met up. You put a couple of S's in to actually make a match when you complete your oval. And an S bridge, the approaches are on an angle, like a part of a question mark, to actually straighten the road out. And there is an S bridge in Ohio also, and several others farther west. There was also a magnificent stone arch bridge in the Narrows of Maryland, which was demolished when Cumberland improved the flood control on Wills Creek many, many years ago. That disappeared. That was built in the 1830s. And of course, the Wheeling Suspension Bridge, built by Charles Ellett Jr., which still carries traffic to Wheeling Island today. At the time the Wheeling Bridge was built, it was the world's longest suspension bridge. Later bypassed by the Cincinnati Suspension Bridge that was built a few years later. This too is a National Historic Landmark designated in 1974. And I just read this winter there was some issue with one of the cables had to be strengthened or redone. Dr. Kemp worked on restoration of this bridge at least twice, I think, in the maybe the 70s and again in the 90s. And then finally, this one that you really don't see now in Brownsville, the nation's first cast iron bridge spans Dunlap Creek, tributary of Monongahela in downtown Brownsville. And unfortunately today it's completely surrounded by development, and there's been a modern guardrail put on it and some reinforcements. So you don't know that this very important iron bridge is still there, but it's still there. And it was built in 1836 at the end of the federal involvement in the road.
What did they use to coat cast iron to make it preserve for some years?
I'm not sure they did anything special with it. It's still carried, they've never reduced the weight limit on that bridge, as I understand it. It was extremely well designed and well built.
Is it cast or rock?
It's a cast iron bridge. You can't see, but these are all cast iron tubular members that are all basically pinned together. And there is some wrought iron in it as well, but I think most of the wrought iron is more decorative and right there. Okay, in summary, for construction, it cost about $1.7 million to build the road. We long for those good old days. That wouldn't get you a mile of highway in West Virginia today. Equivalent of about $30 million in modern money. The final cost was more than double what the estimate had been, about $13,000 per mile. And strangely, the Cumberland to Uniontown section cost under $10,000, but the Uniontown to Wheeling section, again, gentler terrain, less large waterways to cross, was $16,000 a mile. And there was an investigation. It turns out that the cause was reckless extravagance and too liberal contracts being let. Remember Josiah Thompson? He was superintendent of the Western Division. He was actually investigated and ultimately fired as superintendent because he was in charge of letting those too liberal contracts. He ended up bearing the brunt for a lot of other contractors that probably built the government out of some money. Almost immediately after the road was completed in 1821, it began to fall apart. By 1822, there were numerous reports of the road being impassable, and shunpikers, as they would later be called, would actually find their own routes around to stay up out of the mud or out of the worn-out roadbed, taking shortcuts or taking alternative routes. And the reason it wore out is right here. So popular that in 1822 alone, Wheeling had over 5,000 wagon loads of freight arrive in Wheeling over the National Road. And again, those wagons, some of them were over a ton and a half in weight. It's a great quote, isn't it? This is a writer of the day. He said, "The ruts are worn so broad and deep by heavy travel that an army of pygmies might march into the bosom of the country under the cover they would afford." Not impressed at all. The transit time on the road in some cases would take hours and hours or sometimes days to go a few miles after it began to deteriorate. There'd be a long line of traffic waiting to pass, and what had been our nation's pride essentially turned into our shame very shortly after it was completed. And those are some of the words that travelers would use to describe it. A lot of European travelers would take the tour of the states in those days, and then write about their experiences and then sell their journals. And almost all of them traveled during this period commented on the road itself, how they were expecting this great road and they were bitterly disappointed. There was a plan to actually fund repairs, and it was championed by politicians, Henry Clay and others, who realized that it's not enough to finance building it, you got to repair it. Does this sound familiar with our infrastructure today? However, President Monroe vetoed the Cumberland Road bill, which had set up a system of funding repairs, called it unconstitutional. The Constitution does not allow for public money to be used for repairing public transportation systems. So what do we do now? We've got a road that's falling apart. The bridges were fine, but the road was bad. Congress eventually found another way to fund it. They appropriated public funds to repair the road east of the Ohio and continue it farther west. Wheeling would be the terminal point only for a few short years. The plan was to eventually carry the road to the Mississippi River because westward expansion was moving there very rapidly. Now enter the Corps of Engineers. At this point, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had expanded their mission beyond just working on military roads and building military forts and doing military engineering, but they're now doing civilian engineering projects. Starting in 1829 and going through the 1840s, the Corps supervised the complete rebuilding of the eastern section with a new type of pavement, the Macadam system, and they supervised all construction west of the Ohio. And the records that they kept are meticulous, of course, as you would expect. Any military man knows. You document it, you keep records, and that's why all this stuff wound up in the U.S. Army Corps' record group at the National Archives. Once those repairs were done and completed in the mid-1830s, there was a deal cut with each of the 3 states east of the Ohio to transfer the road to those states, and the states would operate the road as a turnpike. And we enter the what were called the palmy days of the pike. The Macadam system would be the method used to repair the road, and by that time, John Loudon Macadam, a Scottish engineer and road builder, had devised a system of road building, which in hindsight is simple, but he's the man that devised it. And today, the term tarmac comes from tar macadam. And macadam surface is used loosely for any sort of surface that's bound together with some type of binder. And the original macadam plan, macadam system, included drainage ditches, very important here, in order for the water to be channeled away from the roadbed, built on a camber, but not a real steep camber at all. Essentially, the first layer, the bottom layer, were stones broken and pieced together. None of those stones would weigh more than 6 ounces or be any larger than 2 inches. And there were rings that were actually issued to the workers, and they had to sit on the side of the road, breaking rock and sizing them through 2-inch rings. I also read that some of the workers actually put the stones in their mouth to determine if the size was right or not. I'm not sure I did that. The top layer was essentially a binding layer. It was just a layer of smaller gravel or smaller stones, varied between 1 and 2 inches in thickness. Not very much right there. But miraculously, the Macadam system was a far superior system. It was cheaper, and it kept the roadbed a lot drier. It had a method of draining. And of course, failed to mention that there were a lot of culverts, stone culverts, that had originally been built and then rebuilt and improved on when the Corps built it. The first use of the Macadam system in the United States was on a feeder pike to the National Road east of Cumberland, the Boonesboro Pike, and then starting in 1825 up to the end of construction, Macadam was used for the National Road. So the second use of the Macadam system was on the National Road. And the supervision of of construction and repairs was done by military engineers, not civilian guys like David Schreiber, but they were actually military officers, Army officers assigned to the project. And I was wondering, how could we afford to divert so many military engineers to this civilian project? And it dawned on me, we were not at war with anybody at that time. This was essentially the era of good feelings, and we were not actively at war. We were between the War of 1812 and the Mexican War, so we probably had a lot of engineers that could be put on the project. These are drawings that were done by the Federal Highway Administration in a large book I have on the history of road building. And this depicts a crew. There's the superintendent dressed quite handsomely, weighing those 6-ounce stones, and these workers are sitting there breaking the rock and sizing them through the 2-inch rings. And then these workers, of course, are laying the roadbed. And that's probably an accurate depiction of how the road was built. There was some cutting and filling done, but it was done on a very, very small scale, given the technology that existed, using manual labor for the most part. Now, by the mid-1830s, the National Road becomes the National Pike, as it historically would be known later on. It was a toll road east of Ohio, which each of the 3 states taking the tolls and putting the tolls back into maintaining the road, hopefully in perpetuity or until it's no longer needed. There are several toll houses that still exist. This one is in LaVale, Maryland. Unfortunately, it's sandwiched between a bunch of modern development, and you can kind of miss it as you drive by it. It's just outside of Cumberland in LaVale. This is Addison Toll House, a handsome cut stone house in eastern PA. This is Seawright's Toll House. And these were standard plans for toll houses. If you look at European toll houses in Scotland or Great Britain, they look like these in terms of their design. And this was simply because the toll taker and his family lived in the house, and their job was to go out, accept the tolls, and turn the pike when someone came to pay their tolls. And literally, a turnpike had a pike that turned after you paid the toll. This is where shunt pikers would come in also to avoid paying tolls, like I sometimes do on the West Virginia Turnpike. I get off at Mossy, so I can avoid that now $2. Shunt pikers did the same thing. They would divert and make routes around the toll houses to keep from paying the toll. And it was based on the number of axles or the number of head of livestock that you were driving on the road. As a result of being the terminal point, the jumping off point for the road, Wheeling blossomed. Wheeling mushroomed into a real city, became an industrial city before the railroad got there. The B&O, when it arrives in 1852, would further bolster Wheeling's fortunes, but the National Road really is what put Wheeling on the map first and led to the development of many of the businesses that later thrived, like Block Brothers, Tobacco, and many, many others that would call Wheeling home. The population of Wheeling reached 11,000 by 1850, and it would become the 2nd largest city in Virginia. That's 2 years before the B&O arrived at Wheeling. Now, once the B&O does arrive, it doesn't take long before the National Road would be diminished significantly. And if you're relying on the tolls to keep the road in good repair, if people aren't paying tolls, the road's going to fall apart, which it would do. By the time we get to the 1870s, the road was virtually back where it was in the 1820s, with no means to improve it again until the automobile era comes along. There were also a number of feeder turnpikes all over Maryland, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, short north-south routes or other routes that would feed into the pike. And if you were a farmer or if you had a cast iron stove business in Brandonville, West Virginia, and there was one, you could take the Brandonville Pike up to the National Road in PA, get your goods to market that way. I didn't delve too much in the western extension, because I had enough to write about with the eastern part of the route. But the road did continue. Between the 1820s and 1840, the road continued through Ohio, Indiana, and the idea was it would reach the Mississippi River. But our nation's fancy turned away from highways in favor of canals and railroads. And ultimately, Congress lost interest in funding the national road, and President Andrew Jackson did not want federal money to go to building more road. So about 50 miles shy of the Mississippi, the road just stopped. It ended. And there was actually two dirt roads that went on. One went to St. Louis, one went to Alton, and that's how the road ended. It just sort of whimpered out to the end. But you'll notice that it went through all the state capitals. It really helped develop Columbus, and then Indianapolis, Richmond, which is in the eastern part of Indiana. Vandalia then was the capital of Illinois. Just in summary, was the road a success? I've read some sources that say it was an utter failure because of the funding fiasco. But for the folks that lived along the road, even long after it was a major thoroughfare, like you, I was talking to this lady earlier, Dennis Strong's mother. She grew up on the national road in western PA and traveled it every day on the way to school and back, right, for years and years and years. So folks living there, it remained a main road. It did represent the longest continuous overland route during the time period that stretched from the Chesapeake to almost the Mississippi River, 700 miles or so in distance. The road, not so good, but the bridges, as I mentioned, are still there. Many of them still carrying traffic, as I mentioned. A lot of the culverts are still there, which are smaller bridges, and some of the other original parts of the road exist, including the rights-of-way. Did we learn any lessons with no provisions for repairs? Well, I'm not sure, because we're still talking about making money available for infrastructure repairs and development. If you've been on the interstate bridge lately, you know there's a lot of money being poured into improving it, including a contra lane, which I've never heard of until last week. The Corps of Engineers gets involved. They do rebuild on the state-of-the-art Macadam plan. I should say that military engineers were learning at West Point. They were learning the state-of-the-art engineering techniques that they could use. Their textbooks all talk about Macadam and Telford and Trezeguet systems. So they came in educated and they knew how to build roads far better than the civilians who basically were just local contractors who decided they could build a highway with mixed success. Ultimately, President Jackson killed the funding for the road, and the government would build no more roads, would not be involved in internal improvements until the 20th century and the automobile era. The road does get rediscovered as one of many transcontinental routes that were being promoted in the early 20th century. It would become part of what was known as the National Old Wales Road Association. And there are a number of these private associations that basically consisted of people all along the route. The original length of this road as a transcontinental route started in Atlantic City and ended in San Francisco, and the National Road was part of it. Later on, in 1925, with the passage of a Federal Highway Act designating U.S. highways and putting money into construction, the old road and this transcontinental route would be signed and designated as U.S. Route 40, which it would remain until fairly recently. And now it is Scenic 40. The original route of the road to and through Illinois was designated a National Scenic Byway in 2000 and christened, given sainthood, I guess, in terms of highways, designated as an all-American road a couple of years after that. And that includes Maryland, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, all the way to the end. Today you can drive long stretches of it, stay in beds and breakfasts that date to the 1800s, see the engineering works that I mentioned, and you will encounter original mile markers or some that have recently been erected that meet modern highway standards in terms of breaking away if you hit them. I think they're made out of fiberglass, but they're cast from an original mold. So they look the same, they're the same size, they're painted, but they're not cast iron. And some of them are still right up along the side of the highway. That concludes the National Road. Thank you. I will entertain any questions. Mr. Swint.
So, Joe, I had the privilege of going to the B&O Railroad Museum a couple of weeks ago in Baltimore. And they have on display a National Road stagecoach company, stagecoach. I don't know if it's a replica or a restoration, but there's an exhibit that talks about how the B&O Railroad, as soon as it came online, it rendered not only the C&O Canal obsolete overnight, but the National Road. And there are excerpts from a woman's report of riding in a stagecoach and having her head pounded against the side of the stagecoach.
You were beat to death on that.
Versus hopping on the magic carpet of the B&O Railroad.
Yeah, remember locomotives traveled, what, maybe 35 miles an hour in those days, but that was the fastest that humans had gone, pretty much, unless you're on a galloping horse. So it was a world of improvement. And you're exactly right, the hazards of traveling on the road were great, including highwaymen. There was an area in western Maryland known as the Shades of Death, which just sounds ominous, and it was basically a tree-lined area where it was dark during the day. It was known as a hangout for highwaymen that would hold up stages, like in the Old West, rob passengers of all their worldly possessions. So armed guards often would have to ride shotgun on the wagons. If you're interested in that aspect of the road, C. Wright's book goes into the lore of the wagon masters, and he talks about some of the legendary wagoners on the road that could make the trip in X number of hours, and it's a pretty interesting read, very heroic read.
What was the standard width of the road?
66 feet. 66 feet was the right of way. That included the ditches on the side. So it was in that respect, it was a two-lane road. It was, I'm not sure what highway standard is today, but that probably rivaled, and there was enough room for folks to travel both directions.
But that was room for the ditches and slopes and that sort of thing. How wide was the
actual road bed?
pavement?
It was not considerably less than that I recall. I can't give you an exact number. Don?
I looked at a lot of stuff on the Stanton-Parkersburg Turnpike and the Beverly Fairmont Turnpike. The road beds on those, the road beds themselves between the ditches, were anywhere from 12 to 16 feet, and they were building them for between $500 and $1,000 a mile, a lot cheaper than the National Road. And for drainage purposes, instead of culverts, they simply had gutters where they just lined a dip in the road with stones. It's kind of surprised me, having seen those contracts on our turnpikes, how much more money they spent on this.
Yeah, this was a substantial project. It was the largest civil engineering project we had really embarked upon at the time, but later on it would be bypassed by many others. And the Erie Canal really, captured the nation's fancy just about the same time the road was being complete. And most states that could build canals, which West Virginia is not one because of our terrain, but most states decided that they wanted a canal. And the formula for canal building was state funds and private subscriptions, which would be the formula that we would use later on for internal improvements into the 20th century, into the automobile era.
I also found it interesting, your comments on the drainage on the road. There's a copy of a report from Claudius Crozet, who was also a principal engineer of Virginia, in the 1820s when he had examined some roads and said it was a constant source of frustration to him that the men in charge of maintaining roads could not be made to understand the importance of keeping water off the surface of the road.
Oh, there are endless
They
letters.
still don't have that down.
There are endless letters, especially when the military engineers got involved, where they're trying to drill into the heads of people that keep the roadbed dry, and that's the key to keeping the road intact. And you're right. I know. There are still some old stone box culverts in western Pennsylvania, and maybe in the West Virginia portion of the road, which are
Laid up stone
Yeah,
culverts.
yes.
That's amazing.
Yeah, they're handsome to look at and very functional. Yes, sir.
Let me ask you kind of a business question here. Let's suppose I'm an Ohio farmer.
Yes.
Okay, I know I don't look much like one, or sound much like one, but, I've been shipping stuff down the Ohio River to the Mississippi to New Orleans and then round to Baltimore and New
Yes.
York
Right.
and Philadelphia, okay? What's going to be the competitive advantage of the national road to me? Is there anything from my produce I'm going to find economic to ship that way, or do I just stick with the river and lay to the canal?
Probably the best thing would be getting your goods to market quicker. Beyond that, if it's just agricultural goods,
Yeah.
you could get there maybe more directly, obviously. If spoilage is an issue,
Okay,
you
yeah.
can get it there a lot quicker. One thing the road was known for is livestock on the hoof being driven, which is another of the factors that led to its demise. 1,000 head of cattle, 1,000 Kentucky mules, hogs. There were these epic hog drives that people would just stand and watch as they drove right through the middle of Main Street. And the drovers would round them all up as they're going to people's yards and, eating everything as they walked through. So it must have been quite a sight.
Grazing on the pastures.
Yeah, right, because they've got to eat on the way to the market, of course. And they would stay, overnight they would lodge at inns and a variety of different establishments, some more upscale, others a bit shady, some that basically you rented by the square foot of space, just to give you a dry place maybe to stay overnight.
Right, yeah. I think the other factor is, and you make the point about spoilage and time to market. If I'm shipping my flatboat downstream, so is everybody else. By the time I get to New Orleans, the prices are depressed.
That's
And,
exactly right, yeah. Right.
Everybody's selling at that point, so I maybe spend a bit more, get it there quicker, and make more on it. So
Especially perishable goods.
yeah, was the commercial intelligence coming back like, hogs are selling at such and such in Baltimore today? I mean, did the postal system do that? Yeah.
Yes, it would, and also travelers on the route. I mean, remember, this was a corridor of communication all the way through. One of the side plots here, which I'd be interested in exploring, is remember before the Civil War, the National Road went through a slave state first, then passed through a free northern state, and then back into a slave state.
Right.
And there were numerous accounts of slaves being driven to Virginia along the National Road through Pennsylvania in shackles, and to the outrage of many travelers on the road. So that must have been quite a sight also, and left an impact on a lot of folks. Yes, Ken.
Considering the federal government had to send troops to western Pennsylvania to put down the Whiskey Rebellion, was there any indication that there was a military purpose for that road?
I have never come across it, although I have wondered myself. And I would imagine, given its origins as a military road during the French and Indian War, certainly, and with the idea that military engineers built it to last. But I saw no indication in all the initial correspondence and construction was all strictly civilian internal improvements and binding the nation together as one people, and of course creating markets also and linking markets. But very good question. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
I grew up in Wheeling where I heard, of course, the myth that Macadam did it. The other myth was that it came through Wheeling because Henry Clay's favorite brothel was there. Is that true, or was that made up by the people in Wellsburg?
Yeah, because that's another interesting story, because Wellsburg really desperately wanted the road, and that was one of when you read the surveyor's journals, the commissioner's journals, they actually went to Wellsburg and surveyed and met with the townspeople in Wellsburg, but Wheeling had much more favorable conditions. And another thing that Wheeling has, of course, which is why the suspension bridge was built, is Wheeling Island. And if you're going to cross the Ohio River, it's better to break it up into two shorter passages which there was no bridge at the time, but it also met up with Zane's Trace, which went on to the interior to present-day Maysville, Ohio, then known as Limestone, which was a post road built by the Zane brothers. But yeah, Wellsburg and Wheeling were in competition, and of course, and then later Wheeling and Pittsburgh would compete. And actually, one of the stories which resulted in a court case involves the suspension bridge. Steamboats going up to Pittsburgh later on tried to burn down the suspension bridge. They stoked their boilers as they went under the bridge. I'm not sure how you burn up a suspension bridge, but and then there was a court case because they complained that the bridge was too low, and they eventually would have to hinge their stacks to go under the suspension bridge and resolve that issue.
Did you learn anything, or is there anything available about the excavating equipment, grading equipment, if any?
Yes, if you look at the standard construction manuals of the day, there are a handful of texts that especially the military engineers would use, but any self-respecting engineer of the day who was self-educated, which most engineers were, unless you had a military background, there were standard works that describe the type of tools that you would use and excavating techniques. I can't remember specifically what they are, but there are sketches of earth-moving equipment, all pretty much hand tools. There's nothing other than some horse-drawn, really plows and graders and things like that, but they were not used at great length that I found. Yes.
How local was the labor as they moved along? And also, do you know anything about the quarrying of the stone? Was that, local as they moved along, or were there just a few choice places and then they transported?
What I found is that the contracts often would specify where the stone was coming from, and a contractor would have to show that he had enough stone to actually fulfill the contract that he was bidding on. And in most cases, the stone was local. The farther away it came from, the more expensive it would be to build. So to keep the cost down, there were local quarries that were used for construction. And the labor supply, typically these immigrants went where the jobs were. Once the road project wound up, the B&O was breaking ground in Baltimore, moving west. The Erie Canal was being built in New York, and then later on, canals were built all over the United States. So a lot of these laborers would leave one project and go to the next, and just keep on migrating to where the work was.
A lot of the Irish worked on the turnpikes in northwestern Virginia. The abutments for the Philippi Bridge were built by the O'Brien brothers.
Yeah, yes. Yes, ma'am.
I have a little silly trivia thing that I have wondered about. It goes east-west. Does it actually touch water, or is there a highway system that actually touches water that can say it is truly the east-west? Like water to water?
Like linking the eastern and western waters, so to speak? I think it's more metaphorically speaking.
I mean, but because they always say east-west, but this doesn't actually go to wherever. There's
Right.
always that little short. Like I've even Googled it to try to figure it out.
Well, in this case, the road began
It starts
in Baltimore, yeah, and then continued on right to the Ohio River, right in downtown Wheeling, which is right on the riverbank. And then once the suspension bridge was built, bridged right over it, and it just kept on going west.
Yeah, it went to the river because before the bridge, they had to load on the
And there, exactly, and there, yeah.
Right down the water.
I mean, there was a wharf.
Yeah.
Every town had a wharf, and riverboats would load and discharge cargo there. Wheeling, which later becomes our Independence Hall in West Virginia, of course, where all the statehood activity took place was in the Custom House in Wheeling, which today we call the Federal Building. And Wheeling actually had a customs office because so much freight was being handled in Wheeling. They actually had customs officials, and it was designated as an inland port. Yes, ma'am, Mary.
At least one of the bridges, the Elm Grove,
Elm Grove?
was built before the Army Corps of Engineers would have been involved. So my question is, what explains the higher quality of the bridge construction relative to the road construction from that time?
That is a good question. Cut stone bridges, stone arch bridges have been around since the Middle Ages, and they're relatively easy to build if you know how to build them. You don't need a lot of sophisticated material. You need a supply of stones. You need a good mason or several masons. The technology itself was readily available. The specifications of the contracts called for the dimensions, and the contractors hit it right. I mean, the guys, Kincaid, Beck, and Evans, was a firm that banded together for the Great Crossings Bridge, and each one of them had experience as a bridge builder. So what's miraculous is that almost all the bridges worked out very well. I don't think I found any instance where a bridge contractor didn't fulfill his contract. So it was a pretty meticulous investigation that went into actually hiring the contractors, as far as I know. But beyond that, there was clearly interest in building the bridges substantial enough to withstand the elements and to carry this great road. There was a sense of pride also. I mean, we're a new nation. We're becoming a great nation. We want to show the world that we have technology that rivals, at the time, what you would have found in Great Britain and Scotland. Telford, Macadam, and others were building these wonderful bridges. It's the best answer I can supply. Russ?
I wonder if there's a phenomenon that a society establishes and improves an infrastructure up to a critical point where subsequent generations are not even able to feasibly sustain what they've inherited.
It's possible, although one would think a country as wealthy as ours could maintain its infrastructure, right? But yeah, I think it's the age-old question, perhaps. But I mean, the technology used on the road was nothing spectacular. It was except for the Macadam principle when it was introduced, which is in hindsight a pretty simple method, but no one had done it until he comes along. But it's an interesting question, and tribute to I think all the folks that actually were committed to this project.
The tar that you spoke of is bitumen tar, isn't it?
It is.
It's made out of coal,
Yeah.
probably.
And that's the binder on top, right? Yes. It holds everything together. Yes. Yes, sir.
Have you driven old Route 40?
I have, yeah.
Okay. Recently?
Well, no, it's probably been 8 years since I was on the route.
Well, somewhere on that route, on top of a mountain over in India, back in the 50s. I'm always curious, does it still stand?
No. Do you know where?
No, all I remember was on top, rolled over the top.
Okay. Wait, that sounds like at the statue in Wheeling, the top of Wheeling Hill, right?
McCullough's Leap?
McCullough's Leap.
Yeah. All I know was on Route 40.
Yeah, it's at the top of the hill. Is that right?
Yeah.
Anybody from Wheeling, right?
Yeah, McCullough Sleep is top of the hill.
Yeah.
Well,
And there's a statue of there's a Native American statue there, right?
Yeah, I can't remember the name of the, I guess it's McCullough, who was in
Yeah, he
Indian later.
left off to escape from attacking Indian raiders, I think. But I think that must be what you
Well,
recall.
what makes it memorable is sometime during the night, as we came through, all around the base was beer bottles.
That sounds like it.
That's really,
And one in his hand, and a pair of panties on his head.
Yeah, the last time I was there,
That's memorable.
it was not kept up very, very well. There was graffiti all around it and some other stuff, sadly. There are also, every state has a statue to the Madonna of the Trail, they were erected, I believe, by the DAR maybe in the 1920s. And they are these large statues of a woman carrying a baby with a flowing road flowing down, traveling west. And they're a symbol of what the road represented. Yes, sir, one more.
Macadam was Scottish, a lot of the old steam engines that drove like the Titanic were Scottish. Where did this, this is out beyond the scope of the lecture, where did Scottish engineering start from? Where did it end?
Can you weigh in on this one?
No, I can't. Yeah, Scotland's a foreign country to me.
Yes, I understand. The development of the steam engine originated in Britain. The Cornish engines, stationary steam engines, some of the early successful engines, first locomotives developed there. Canal builders, both in France and Britain, they were building canals 100 years or more before we started building them here. So the technology existed, the population was there.
It's the Industrial Revolution.
It is. I was going to say, it gets back to the origins of the Industrial Revolution, probably. Yeah.
And Scotty on the Enterprise.
Of course, would take us into space. All right. Thank you all very much for